Today, we'll be taking a look at Columbus Day, the first book in the Expeditionary Force series written by Craig Alanson. As with all my reviews, I'll be giving you a spoiler-free look at the novel's structure, story, its subgenre composition, and my final thoughts on the book. If you'd like to skip ahead to any of these parts, there are timestamps in the description and the scroll bar down below, but of course, you're more than welcome to stick around for the entire video. Thanks for joining me on this review, and let's jump right in. If we first take a look at Columbus Day's structural composition, I'd say that structurally, the novel is split into two very distinct halves. The first half of the novel would be best described as a hardcore military science fiction book with strong comedic elements, while the second half of the novel falls more into the space adventure genre, although again with strong military science fiction and comedic undertones. Columbus Day is for the most part a single protagonist-centered novel, and as a result mainly features only one point-of-view character throughout its entire length, all of which is presented in the first-person, past-tense narration style. That being said, there is an exception to this rule in some of the action sequences in the novel's latter half. There, the perspective switches over to some of the book's supporting cast, and also brings about a stylistic change in the novel's narration, as these segments are presented in the third-person past-tense prose. Moving on to the novel's story, it's really hard to condense down the overall narrative direction of Columbus Day into a single thought or idea, especially without going into any spoilers. As I've already mentioned at the start, the novel feels very similar to other hardcore military science fiction novels out on the market, featuring the usual military training, alien invasion, and low-rank infantry boots-on-the-ground tropes that you'd expect from the genre. However, this first impression, although admittedly it does last until the halfway point of the novel, really isn't representative of the novel's true nature, let alone that of the entire series. Because, with the late introduction of the novel's second protagonist, the book transforms into a very unique space adventure story, and you'll just have to read the novel to figure out exactly what I mean by that. I guess at its heart, Columbus Day could be described as a story of human perseverance and ingenuity in times of great hardship, and also a story of an unlikely friendship between two very different beings. And in my experience, Craig Alanson really nailed the execution of both of these aspects of the book, making this novel one of the most emotionally engaging ones that I've read thus far. Next, let's take a look at Columbus Day's subgenre composition. I think it won't be very surprising to hear that the novel features a strong presence of action elements given its military science fiction genre. These elements are quite well spread out across the novel's length and consist of shorter, well-rounded action set pieces. For the most part, these sections are made up of infantry combat sequences, but there are also a handful of air and space battles present in the book, although it does bear mentioning that these last two do gain a higher prevalence in the following installments in the series. What I like most about the action elements of Columbus Day is that they are depicted from a very mature point of view, as the author never shies away from describing the chaos and carnage associated with warfare, all of which is especially surprising given the prominence of the novel's comedic aspects. Speaking of comedy, these elements are the second core building block that makes up Columbus Day's subgenre composition. It goes without saying that these elements for the most part pop up in connection to the novel's dramatic elements, but more on those in a little bit. As far as the comedic elements of the novel, and really the entire series are concerned, they for the most part consist of character-driven humor, mostly in connection to the bromance between the series' two main protagonists. Alongside that, there's also plenty of situation-driven humor and wordplay, all of which works really well to complement some of the novel's more serious themes. And the last of the main subgenre elements is drama. Despite the protagonist's military background, he still often finds himself in situations where he has to flex his interpersonal skills. This can range from minor stuff, like dealing with the soldiers under his immediate command, as well as more diplomacy-oriented tasks, where he effectively serves as an intermediary between cultures. Somewhat connected to these dramatical elements, we have the world-building elements, as much of the novel's world-building gets packaged inside the various pieces of dialogue throughout the story. Obviously, it's hard to go into detail without going into spoilers, but let's just say that these elements set up the basic geopolitical environment our protagonists find themselves in, which also serve as the basis for all future developments in this fictional world that will occur in the following installments in the series. Columbus Day also features its fair share of psychological elements, as the novel gives a lot of attention to its many characters. In this regard, the author often explores, or at least hints at, the emotional ramifications of the events the characters experience, which, in the scope of the wider series, results in very compelling character arcs, even for the supporting cast of characters. I personally really enjoyed this addition to the novel, as it makes the characters feel like living people, making the reading experience so much more enjoyable, and its events that much more impactful. And the last of the three supporting subgenre elements are the philosophical elements that pop up here and there throughout the novel. Some of these touch on the various cultural dynamics, moral and religious questions, as well as the responsibilities associated with military command. In terms of other notable quirks, the novel features quite a few fourth wall breaks where the protagonist addresses you, the reader, directly. What's even more surprising is that these events aren't immersion breaking, but somehow manage to make the protagonist feel more lifelike and relatable. Another cool thing about the novel is that it doesn't only cover the grunt level aspects of military actions, but also gives a large focus on the leadership perspective of military operations. In my experience, it's rather rare for a military science fiction series to go after this aspect of military life, let alone to have it happen in the very first installment of a series. So that's another huge plus for Columbus Day, in my opinion. In conclusion, I think it's pretty clear that I thoroughly enjoyed reading Columbus Day. In fact, I'd even go as far to say that Expeditionary Force has been my favorite military science fiction series ever since I read this book all the way back when it first came out. In my opinion, it's just a perfect mixture of mature science fiction and military themes, while at the same time not taking itself too seriously. The two main protagonists are so fun and endearing that you just keep wanting to come back for more, even though with this particular installment, one of those protagonists has a rather late introduction. Next, we have the world building of this fictional galaxy, which features no black and white good guys or bad guys, unlike most military science fiction series out there. Instead, Columbus Day features several alien species and alliances, all of whom have their own particular interests, so our protagonists have to find a wholly unique way to secure the survival of our civilization. Of course, no book is perfect, and Columbus Day is no exception to that rule. With the Expeditionary series, there is a sort of structural repetition going on throughout its installments, but in my experience, that only becomes noticeable when you get to about the 6th or 7th book in the series, or perhaps even later on if you manage to not binge all the books one after the other. So would I recommend you pick up Columbus Day as your next novel? Well, yes, of course I would. I would even go as far to say that you'll get a lot of enjoyment out of this novel if you have even the slightest interest in the science fiction genre, simply because of the chemistry between the story's main protagonists. This holds especially true if you go for the audiobook version, where R.C.Bray adds a whole new level of depth to this already outstanding story. I will just say that if you don't vibe from the very start of the book, do at least try to hold out until the introduction of the second protagonist about halfway through the novel, since that's where the book shows its true colors for the first time. And as always, if my word isn't enough for you, I'll have the book's usual ratings up on screen for you now. Columbus Day is available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook versions, and comes out at about twice the length of a standard novel, at about 160,000 words for the written versions and 16 hours for the audiobook. Pricing-wise, the ebook is the cheapest like usual, coming in at a very satisfying $3.14, followed by the paperback at just a few cents under $9. And lastly, we have the audiobook version, which costs a whopping $35 if you buy it on Amazon. So here, you're obviously better off just using an Audible credit. Not to mention that Columbus Day frequently pops up in Audible's 2-for-1 sales, so you can get the book for an effective price of $7.50, which is even cheaper than the paperback. But as always, prices might have changed by the time you're watching this video, so I'll have an Amazon link in the description below, so you can check for current pricing should you be tempted by this novel. And with that, we've made it to the end of the spoiler-free section of this review, and we'll be moving on to the writing-oriented lessons section next. But before then, I'd just like to thank you for sticking around this long into the video, and ask you to leave a like down below if you enjoyed the review, or maybe even subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future. Also, if you feel that I misrepresented the book in some way, or forgot to mention something important, don't hesitate to leave me a comment down below, as I make an effort to reply to every one of them. Now, let's get on to the lesson section, so spoiler warning ahead. So with Columbus Day, I'll again be talking about the importance of setting expectations early on in your novel, and how that ties into retaining your readers all the way until the end of your book. I've already covered this topic in a couple of previous videos, like the Red Seas Under Red Skies and Space Team reviews, so I'll try to keep this brief. Earlier on in the video, I already mentioned a couple of times how Columbus Day is split into two thematically very different halves. If you've already read the novel for yourself, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. The first 8 hours of Columbus Day thematically and narratively very strongly conform to the hardcore military science fiction genre and its tropes. If we go through a quick checklist, does the novel begin with an unexpected alien invasion of Earth? Yes, it does. Is the protagonist of the book a low-ranking member in the military? Well, Bishop is a specialist, so that also checks out. Third, does the first third of the novel consist of a training sequence where the protagonist learns basic military skills? Well, arguably, Bishop is already a veteran of the army, but we have the Camp Alpha sequence where Bishop gets accustomed to humanity's newly improved weaponry, and also a large part of his early assignments consist of him learning the ropes of military command after his unexpected promotion to sergeant and colonel. And lastly, do the protagonist's actions have seemingly no effect on the invading alien force? Well, the Expeditionary Force technically isn't directly involved in fighting back an invading force of Earth, but their assignment on Paradise, where they're tasked with evacuating the local civilian population, does kind of conjure the same feelings of them not actually providing any real security to the well-being of Earth. So that's another check on our military science fiction trope bingo. But the moment Skippy, the second protagonist, and an ancient alien AI gets introduced into the story, the novel deviates from these tropes. Suddenly, humanity isn't totally powerless against their technologically advanced alien oppressors, and instead even have access to some technology that is out of reach even to the oldest and most advanced species they might encounter. Secondly, the protagonist goes from being a very passive character who's just trying to make the most out of a very restricted situation on Paradise to being the captain of a spaceship and actively begins to find ways to actively improve the situation of humanity in this war-torn galaxy. And in this respect, transforming the novel from the stereotypical military science fiction thematic to a more space adventure theme with military science fiction elements. And it bears mentioning that it is this latter theme that gets carried over to all the subsequent books in the series. All of that being said, I think you can agree how the beginning part of the novel doesn't really represent what the rest of the novel and the entire series is really about, which in turn risks readers giving up on the novel early on in their read-through because they form an inaccurate image of what the series will be about and simply don't find that image interesting or entertaining enough. Now, please don't misunderstand. There's nothing inherently wrong with starting off your novel with a slightly different theme to get the world and character setup out of the way before jumping into the actual story you intend to tell, but Columbus Day, in my opinion, takes this concept a bit too far, since this introduction literally makes up half of the novel's total length. In fact, had the series been split up into standard-length novels of 80,000 words instead of the 160,000 we have, then that would have meant that the entire first volume of the series would have been completely different in tone and theme to the following books in the series. I think that another really telling indicator that this duality of Columbus Day is a somewhat problematic aspect of the novel is the sheer number of reviews that mention and suggest that you should stick with the novel until the latter half where Skippy gets introduced. I mean, if your book requires some external motivational factor to convince a reader to finish a read-through, then that doesn't really instill a lot of confidence in me as a potential reader. Just think back to all the classical books you were forced to read throughout high school and ask yourselves, how many of those books would have you read had they not been connected to some sort of exam or essay? What I will say, however, is that Columbus Day's saving grace in the first half of the novel is the likability of Bishop, its main character. I would be willing to bet that one of the main reasons that readers got through the first half of the novel is them getting hooked to Bishop and getting invested in him and his experience in the war in the early pages of the book. And again, if you'd like 2 more perspectives on this management of expectations, I invite you to follow the links in the top right of your screen to my Red Seas Under Red Skies review and my Space Team review, or you can just check for links in the description below. And with that, we've come to the end of my Columbus Day review. Again, I'd like to thank you for sticking around this long into the video, and I sincerely hope you enjoyed the review and found it useful and entertaining in some way. Again, I'd like to remind you to leave a like or a comment on the video, as that tremendously helps the channel in the eyes of the almighty algorithm, but of course, if you're not into that, that's perfectly okay. Have a wonderful week, and I hope to see you on the next review.